I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to More Conversations. With us is the author, Michael Shnayerson. Michael Shnayerson has written 6 books on a variety of subjects. The first, in 2008, Coal River, was a compelling portrait of the people in West Virginia, risking their reputations and livelihoods in the fight against King Coal. The second, The Car That Could, the inside story of GM's revolutionary electric vehicle, was the first book to penetrate the silence surrounding GM's risky and successful decision to become the world's first mass producer of the electric car. He wrote a biography of the iconic writer Irwin Shaw, writer of the anti-war play Bury the Dead. We did that in high school. Then there was The Killers Within, the deadly rise of drug-resistant bacteria. In 2015, he wrote an unauthorized biography, The Contender, a book not about Terry Malloy and On the Waterfront, but about the stalled quest of our governor, Andrew Cuomo, to become president of the United States. Recently, he released his most successful work, Boom, a best-selling tale of how a coterie of art dealers made a global market for contemporary art, amassing fortunes by placing trophy art objects with super wealthy collectors. I am delighted to welcome Michael Shnayerson to this table. Now, Michael, Peggy Guggenheim, the eminent and renowned collector, said the entire art movement has become an enormous business venture. She said that in 1960.
1960, yeah.
A lot has happened since then.
Indeed, it
Now,
has.
has it become an enormous business venture?
Oh, it certainly is. My book starts in the late 40s when the whole art world was just a handful of people down in Greenwich Village, and it carries it on up to today when it really is this global bazaar of billions of dollars, manipulated to some degree by the dealers who represent these extraordinary artists.
Now, Peggy Guggenheim died in 1979, and there's been an escalation in prices since then, which she wouldn't have even dreamed of.
That's true.
And what accounts for that? Is it just the rise in is it inflation, the rise in GDP, the rise in the stock market? Does it track the art market, or is it something else?
Well, there are a number of factors, or really sort of milestones along the way. I mean, in a sense, the first milestone is the Skull auction of 1973. If you remember, Robert and Ethel Skull are these major collectors of contemporary art that at that time, meaning, you know, Warhol and Lichtenstein and Rosenquist and these. And they decide to sell a lot of their stuff at auction. And everyone still has the feeling that, or the sense that this work can be bought for pennies. And that night, the entire art market is transformed because this stuff goes for hundreds of thousands of dollars. People are stunned. So that's a first milestone.
Just hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And he made more on that than he ever made in the taxi business.
That's right. So that's one milestone.
Skull's Angels, I think it was called.
I think that the early 80s is another milestone because you have the beginning of the bull market. You have Reagan money. You have young people working on Wall Street and having the money to put something on their walls. But then I think as you go on through the 80s, where it gets truly crazed and frothy, if you will, there's a milestone at the end because it all goes down with the end of the 80s. And it doesn't really come up again until about 1999. And what's interesting about that is that it's the year that Leo Castelli died. And Leo Castelli, major dealer of the 50s, 60s, 70s, I mean, the prince of the whole downtown art scene, if you will. And his death, he was about 90, at that time, really ushered in a whole new era. It's not just because of him. It's almost despite him. It's the fact that with him gone, a whole other world of people come into this field. Billionaires, for example. You know, in the 80s, there were a couple hundred billionaires in the world. 1999, there start to be over 1,000. Now there are 2,000. These people have extraordinary money to spend on art.
But it's been said that Castelli was more interested in the art than
Yes,
the money.
Absolutely, he was. there's a funny
I mean,
story.
He brought out Rauschenberg and Jasper
He did.
Johns and
He did.
introduced them to the
He was
public.
passionate about art. He didn't mind making a profit from the art he handled, but he could also be just as happy paying a stipend to an artist for years until his work started to sell. I mean, he really was an extraordinary figure. There's a great story I tell in the book about Castelli just starting his gallery in 1957. And he's got one artist, Rauschenberg, making these strange collages, and he needs another artist. So he goes to the Jewish Museum to a show of abstract expressionists, and he sees this nice painting that's sort of like a green target. Never heard of the artist, Jasper Johns. He just sort of files away in the back of his head. That night, he and his wife, Ileana Sonnabend, herself a dealer, possibly better than Castelli, most people would say, they go down to visit Rauschenberg and to see his new work that's going to be put in their new gallery. And Rauschenberg offers them a drink, and he says, well, do you have some ice? And Rauschenberg says, well, I don't have any ice, but my friend Jasper downstairs has some. And Castelli goes, Jasper? Jasper? Is that Jasper Johns, whose work I saw just today at the Jewish Museum? And indeed it is. And so he says, I must see it. So they go downstairs in this loft building, open the door, and it was the most extraordinary moment of Leo Castelli's life. There's like 30 Jasper John paintings never seen by anyone else. So this is the kind of world that Castelli occupied and made possible.
A watershed over ice.
A watershed,
Over ice.
Very good, very good. But you know, things do change in the early OOs, and one of them is the oncoming billionaires, but another is the auction world. The auction houses realize they've been spending all this time putting, you know, 100-year-old paintings up for auction, paintings whose creators have long since died. Now they realize that there's a market for living artists. There's a market for artists who are in their 20s. You can make up a reputation for a young artist, put him on auction, and by God, the next thing you know, he's selling for $2 or $3 million a painting. And that began to happen.
Now, with the escalation of prices, was there also an escalation in the margins which dealers were able to harvest?
Well, sure. Everybody got very excited by the spike in prices that would often occur between what they call the primary and the secondary markets, okay? In a sentence, primary is the artist's work when it's first created. Anything that's just come out of his studio is primary. But then when it gets sold again, whether it's sold at auction or anywhere else, it's secondary. It now began to seem as if work, when it went from primary to secondary, or often to the auction market, the price just skyrocketed. And so people came up with this phrase, art as an asset. Art was now as much an asset as any kind of securities on Wall Street.
Or a commodity.
Yeah, a commodity. And they expected...
A lot of it kept in vaults, never to be seen by the public, never even to be seen by the
Well, that's
collectors.
one of the fascinating ironies of this business, that people with a lot of money now buy art expecting it to increase dramatically in a year or two. And until that happens, they put it in what's called a free port. And there are free ports in Geneva and other cities of Europe.
Have you ever visited a free port?
I haven't. I've read about them. They're fascinating.
Are there
these
viewing
vast,
rooms?
Oh, they're as big as football fields.
And they're viewing rooms?
There are little viewing rooms at them. But basically, it's a huge warehouse filled with art that's been bought sort of like at a duty-free shop, you know, where you don't have to pay that tax. You don't have to pay a tax for having bought that art as long as it stays in the free port. Once you take it out of the free port, bring it home, you're supposed to pay the tax. But it's generally recognized that not many people do pay that tax. So it is quite a tax dodge. And that's a very important aspect of all this.
So what happens to that art kept in free ports? Is it sold? Is it eventually exhibited?
Well,
Is
you know,
it donated to museums? I mean, will the public ever see it?
all those things can happen, but the sad thing is that most often what happens is it continues sitting in the free port. Sometimes it gets sold from one owner to another or traded with another work that's just on another shelf in the same Freeport. It never gets out of the Freeport. And so, some of the real masterpieces that we've come to know in the last decades are now just gone, at least effectively gone.
Do any of these collectors really know what's a first-class painting and what isn't? I suppose they have advisors, but Jerry Saltz seems to think, the critic for New York Magazine, that 85% of contemporary art that you see around is crap.
Well, Jerry Saltz, who is close to God in this business, whose incredibly smart comments I used throughout, attributed, of course. Yes, he says that 85% of contemporary art is terrible and doomed to fail. The problem is, what you think is the good 15% is not the 15% that I think is good.
Totally subjective.
Totally subjective. So you don't know. So people keep collecting, hoping that what they've bought does emerge as being in that 15%. But to your earlier point, Jim, there was a time when collectors really knew the genre of art they were collecting.
Let's take another concrete example.
Sure.
The graffiti painter
Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Now, his work was never fully accepted by connoisseurs. I mean, MoMA didn't buy a Basquiat throughout the period where of his heyday.
That's right.
And in the mid-1980s, he was making maybe
$1,000 a painting, maybe.
$1,000 a painting. And by 2017, a
$100
Basquiat of a skull,
Yeah.
just a graffiti work of a skull, went for over $100 million.
Yeah. Well, Basquiat's story is, of course, central to the book and to that whole period.
That's a boom.
Yeah, that is a boom, all right. I'm careful at the start of the book to say I'm not going to judge any artist here. I'm not a critic. I'm not a curator. I'm really just a storyteller. And so, to me, what's interesting about Basquiat is the way his work was recognized immediately by a whole downtown art scene. It didn't take years, really. It took years for the market to catch up to Basquiat, or for the market to propel him to sales of 100 million. But back there in the early 80s, one of the first people to discover him was none other than Larry Gagosian. Everybody thinks of him as the great heathen. Well, he had and still has a very good eye. And he saw right from the start that this young guy...
He has an eye for art or an eye for money?
Well, both, but more an eye for art than people give him credit for. And he was
a disciple of Leo Castelli, whom
he was a disciple. That's right, and a very unlikely one, because the two men couldn't be more different from each other. Yet when Gagosian came from California to kind of make his way in New York, knowing nobody and having no real money,
no art degree,
nothing. Having his big art credential was that he had sold posters out of the trunk of his car in L.A., famous story. But he had moxie, he had a good eye, and he actually impressed Castelli as being the sort of person in a way that Castelli wished he had become. Castelli was this urbane European, spoke 5 languages, but he wasn't a tough guy. And he liked the tough guy part of Gagosian. So
is it necessary to be a tough guy to be an art dealer?
That's a good question, Jim.
Dog-eat-dog market. You have to be tough.
I think that, yes, if toughness means, getting a really good price, or, discovering an artist before everyone else, then sure, you have to be tough. In temperament, most of the dealers that I met were lovely people, and I focused on the dealers.
But does the lovely temperament
belie
an underlying avarice?
It's funny. Just last night, someone asked me, "Do you get in the book? Do you get into the avarice, into the illegalities, into the money laundering?" There's a little bit of that at the end, but to be honest, that's a whole other book. And I am not, you'd almost have to be an investigative financial journalist or prosecutor to determine who's been cheating on what. Every once in a while, some news will pop up. But it's very hard to know how much corruption is going on.
The gallerist Mary Boone, who brought out Schnabels in jail, even.
Well, that's very
tax
true.
evasion.
And I was actually the last person to interview her before she went off to jail. She
Lucky
was
you.
stunned. She was stunned that that this had happened. She basically, her argument was basically, you know, all dealers do this. We all, you know, expense account everything, or call something a business expense when it's not. Actually, she had really pushed the margins by, you know, declaring her whole gallery, her whole apartment to be a gallery. You know, that it's hard to get away with. But
you know, when you have an eponymous trade name like
Yes.
Mary Boone or Larry Gagosian,
Yes.
every cent you spend is arguably a business expense. I mean, it's promoting the brand.
you could say that, but for reasons I can't begin to tell you, legally you actually can't do that. But what I want to say, just in relation to what you said a moment ago, is that when I began, I thought, I'll tell the story of contemporary art, going back to the 40s all the way up to today. And I got about 3 months into this, and I realized this is just such a sprawling subject. I would drown in it. And so that's when I focused on the dealers. And the dealers really are a fascinating breed unto themselves. You know, whether one or another has been implicated in some tax evasion thing at some point or another, the fact is these are generally very smart, passionate people who have done a lot to bring artists along. And I thought that they were a group that had really never been examined in that way. They were examined either just in sort of cold numbers or with a certain amount of scorn as being, you know, wheeler dealers. I found them generally to be an admirable and fascinating bunch.
Well, it sounds as if Wall Street is dog eat dog, the art world is the other way around.
Well, I guess so. Yes. At any rate, I met some wonderful dealers. One of my favorites is Gavin Brown, who is called the Leo Castelli of his age. I mean, he's about 45. Has a sort of piratical black beard. And there's one quick story I'll tell you about Gavin Brown. That one day he came back to his gallery to discover something quite bizarre. The entire floor of his gallery had been jackhammered. It was gone. There was a big pit there. And he knew exactly what had probably happened, what did happen. An artist he knew named Urs Fischer had taken it upon himself to put this hole in the gallery as art. It was art. And so I said to Gavin, well, what happened after that? And he said, well, we sold the hole. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, we sold it to this collector, Peter Brandt, very well-known collectors, close to Warhol, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, but how did Peter Brandt get the hole up from your downtown gallery to his place in Greenwich? And Gavin said, well, of course he didn't do that. He just created a new hole up in Greenwich and called it the hole. And I said, now, Gavin, I've heard a lot of stories, but this is really kind of crazed. You're saying that the new hole is the same as the old hole and they're both art? He said, absolutely. It's all about the idea. And that, I think, is an important point for any aspect of this story. The idea is so important. There's a wonderful artist named Saul LeWitt who, beginning in the 50s, maybe early 60s, he made art, but he didn't make the art itself. He made the directions, and you would buy the directions and make the art yourself. So his style tends to be these square, colored panels on walls, and a whole wall might be covered with them. But he didn't put them there. He just gave you the instructions.
So then you must hire an artisan to apply it to the wall.
And that is, of course, conceptual art.
That's conceptual art, which is another thing.
Yes.
Now, you also write of a certain dodginess among artists and also among collectors. Among artists, you have the African-American artist Mark Bradford, who insisted that a collector pay for 2 paintings but would only get 1.
Right.
And also received a very large donation to his favorite charity from a gallery, so that to induce him to switch galleries from a London gallery to a New York gallery. I mean, it's
you can
pay
judge
to
it
play.
a little bit, yes, you could make that argument. Now, the fact is that Mark Bradford, who is a wonderful artist, one of the best, I think, now that I'm just a civilian again, I'll tell you, I think he's fabulous. But he grew up in south part of L.A., no money. His mother had a beauty salon. He would work in the beauty salon. He actually worked in the salon through his 20s. And he started looking at these end papers that you put in your hair if you're a woman. I don't quite understand what end papers are, but that women seem to recognize them. And he began putting them on big canvases and making this very interesting art out of them. So he has become one of the highest earning and most admired painters in the world. Along the way, he started this...
to prime the pump.
Well, so no, it was sort of a non-profit operation to help young people in South Central LA.
I think foster children, isn't that?
That may be part of it.
Yeah.
I didn't foster, I wasn't sure. But at any rate, he did this as a good thing to help his community. But he did use his muscle, if you will, that he now had as a high-earning artist, to insist, in certain cases, that someone buy 2 paintings instead of 1, and the value of that second painting, if not the actual painting, would go to the nonprofit, which I think is called Art in Progress or something like that. So, you know, it helped poor kids. That doesn't strike me as devious, merely creative.
Okay, so what about the collectors? You know, there was the husband and wife called Rubel, I think Donald Rubel.
Don and Mira Rubel.
And they helped develop the artist Murillo. And
that's right.
They had him at their foundation living there for
Oscar Murillo.
5 weeks. Oscar Murillo for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Jerry Saltz didn't like him very much.
Well,
5 weeks during the summer in Miami, and then everything he made belonged to them. It's almost a sharecropper arrangement.
Interesting way to put it. I don't know you could really disagree with that. I mean, Don and Mira Rubel have done amazing things for the good of the art world. They've got this whole museum down in Miami that is a former DEA warehouse. Instead of harboring drugs, it now harbors art. And they have, through the years, collected art, almost always taking chances on new emerging artists who don't cost much. They like a bargain. But, you know, in the process, they've brought along many, many good artists, including Keith Haring and including Oscar Murillo. But they do have this residency program now, whereby if you're a young artist, you go down there, you stay for 6 weeks, as you've said, you do all this art, your accommodations are there for free, you get free meals, you can create as much art as you want, but it all goes to the Rubels. Now the artists, I talked to one artist who did this in another year. She said, you know, it's okay because I'm getting a lot of publicity for this and I can keep doing art, and if they sell the art to fancy collectors, it's going to increase the art that I create next. So.
Now, an interesting feature of this boom in the art world, at least contemporary art, has been the emergence of African-American art.
Yes, yes.
So is that, and female artists as well. I
Yes.
mean, there's almost a political correctness about it, or an identity politics about it.
You know, you could suspect that. I think it's probably truer to say that there's always been good art created by black artists and women artists. It just didn't get recognized. And it's a good story in the book about one of the very most admired, if not most admired artists today, black artist Kerry James Marshall. A dealer named Jack Shainman, who is white and who has almost always represented artists of color because he was just interested in them, saw a postcard on a colleague's bulletin board with a nice little picture on it, a little reduction of an art painting by somebody. And the guy said, oh yes, that guy's name is Kerry James Marshall. I don't know where he is now. Jack Shainman tracked him down, went from Texas to California to Chicago, finally found the guy, and loved his work. Very figurative, with these characters who are very black, I mean strikingly black, in sort of city playgrounds and settings like that. And he said after a while, Kerry, you are ready for a one-man show. I want to give it to you. And Kerry said, I don't know if I'm really ready. I'm happy here in Chicago. And Shainman persuaded him to let him have a one-man show in New York And at the end of it, only 2 paintings sold. And Shaman was crushed. This was actually in the mid-90s. Shaman was crushed, and he went back to Marshall and said, I'm just so sorry, I don't know what happened. And Marshall took a beat and he said, maybe your buyers aren't ready to see black faces in the paintings on their living room walls. And of course, he was right. Now, everything has changed since then. Now,
Now it's a plus.
Now you've got P. Diddy paying $21 million for a Kerry James Marshall.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to stop. So I have a question for you.
All right.
Michael Shnayerson, should the art market be regulated?
Yes, it is known as the largest unregulated market in the world.
So we need more regulation. Regulate Facebook and regulate the art world.
I think we do.
We'd have to do it. Michael Shnayerson, thank you
Jim,
so much
thank
for
you.
coming by. This has been wonderful. We could have
Terrific.
gone on for another
I'm
half hour.
sorry we can't.
And perhaps we will. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.